I'm going to be reading from Genesis chapter 37, verses 2 through 11. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Bilhah, and his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind.
Well, have you ever been driving and your GPS takes you on an unexpected route? I am a huge fan of Apple Maps. I really am. I love that the map shows you where you're at. I love that it tells you how long it'll take to get to your destination. I love that it tells you even what time you'll arrive at your destination. I love that it even puts that little speed limit in the corner so you know how fast you're supposed to be going. Apple Maps is one of my favorite tools to use when driving almost anywhere, and most of the time, it gets me where I need to go. And it's only happened to me once, but I remember this distinct time where we did not get to the place we were hoping to go. You see, it was a time when my wife Alice and I, we were dating at the time, and we took a day trip up to the mountains in Southern California. And Apple Maps, it took us on an unexpected route. We had been up the mountain before, but this way was new. We had never been this way before, and ended up taking us around the mountain. Now, I reassured my future soon-to-be wife that Apple Maps knows what it's doing. And so we proceeded on that route. Well, as it turns out, it took us on a huge detour. We went around the mountain, and we were trying to go up the back way. And we tried ascending the mountain by taking a back service road that was paved with dirt and gravel. Now, our tiny little Hyundai sedan we were driving was not going to make it up that. And I remember at that moment losing my faith in Apple Maps to get us up the mountain that day. We were so confused, and we questioned, is this the right path to get us to where we're supposed to go? I think we run into the same kind of dilemma in our spiritual lives, don't we? Most of us, we struggle to trust or have faith in God when our life doesn't take the path we expected. It's easier to trust God when we're on the path that we anticipated, on the path that we think is normal. The question that we're going to be answering through Scripture this morning is this: how do I trust God when life doesn't seem to be going according to plan? See, this morning we're in our 4th week of our series titled From Eden to Jesus, which is a journey through the Old Testament stories that shape our faith and reveal God's redemptive plan. From creation, Eden, to the promises of the prophets, we're discovering how every part of Scripture points forward to Jesus. And whether you're new to faith or you've been following for years, there's an invitation for your life still today. And last week, we looked at Abraham's journey of faith. Abraham received God's blessing. He had a son that God had promised him, and he was going to make him into a great nation as his descendants continue to grow. And as the story continues, Abraham finds Isaac, his son, a wife from his hometown. Her name is Rebekah, and they have twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau was a manly man. He liked to hunt, and he grew close to his father. And Jacob, on the other hand, he grew closer to his mother, and he learned to use his mind as his strength. And though Jacob was technically the second-born of the two twins, he was able to trade some stew for his older brother's birthright and receive the family blessing from his father, Isaac. The story continues, and God speaks to Jacob, telling him that he will preserve his descendants and provide them with land. And Jacob marries, and he has 12 children. His 12 children would eventually become the 12 tribes that make up the Israelite nation, descending from Abraham himself. This reveals that God is faithful to the covenant that he made with Abraham years prior. But before that time comes, we are given a story of Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, which is the story that we're going to be looking at this morning. And as we go through this story and walk through it together, we're going to uncover three truths. The first is this, that God is still working when life feels unfair. The second is that God is still working even when we can't see any progress. And the third is that God is still working even in ways we may not understand until much later. Joseph's story, it's what's going to conclude the book of Genesis, and it reveals God's faithfulness to use any situation for his good. And our text this morning is going to be in Genesis chapter 37, starting at verse 12. So if you brought your Bibles, I encourage you turn there with me as we're going to be walking through a lot of scripture together this morning. Allison just read for us the beginning of chapter 37, where Joseph's story begins. We already read that he is his father's favorite, and it's not an internal favoritism either. His father gives him a lavish, ornate robe, letting all of his other 11 brothers know that he is indeed his father's favorite. Joseph stands out from his brothers, not just because of the robe, but also because he receives special dreams. The fact that he received 2 dreams with the same meaning indicates that something is being communicated to him by God. His dream indicates that he will one day be in that position of authority over his family. Joseph's clearly young because he shares his dream to the rest of his brothers that hate him all the more because of it. So let's continue reading and see what Joseph's brothers do with all of their pent-up hatred towards their brother Joseph. Picking up the text in verse 12, it says this. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to them, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent them off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the field and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flock? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him at a distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him in the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing. And they took him and they threw him into a cistern. The cistern was empty and there was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and he mourned his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Joseph was his father's favorite, but his brother's jealousy drove them to betray him. But even though they had evil intent, God isn't absent from the scene. He who gave Joseph the dream of being a ruler will continue to be faithful to that. Even though Joseph was betrayed, God is still with him. See, the brothers' original plot was to kill Joseph, but as they tried to enact their plan, it just so happened that there were traders on their way to Egypt who were traveling by. You see, what appears to be a coincidence in this text is actually God's providence. God is with Joseph even in the midst of his difficulty. And if God is present with Joseph, then he is also present with us. See, this portion of the text is inviting us to see that God uses the difficulty, he doesn't cause it. God did not tell Joseph's brothers to betray him. They are fully responsible for their sin. Yet God is so powerful that he can take what they meant for evil and work it into his good purposes. We live in a world that is constantly waving our finger at God, trying to blame him for the evil that we see existing today. But every story in Genesis so far has been revealing that God is perfect. It's humanity that causes the sin, the evil, the chaos, and the destruction. God isn't the one who told Joseph's brothers to beat him up. God isn't the one who told him to throw him into a cistern, to sell him off to traders, but in his goodness, he's able to take their chaos, their evil, and bring good from that situation. God protected Joseph from death and continued to work through the circumstances he himself did not create, the evil that his brothers intended. And I believe this should bring you a lot of hope this morning, because I'm certain that everyone in this room has their own experience of difficulty in this life. You may have walked through betrayal, just like Joseph did, from the people closest to you. You may have suffered unjustly at the hands of others when you did nothing wrong. There may have been circumstances that came up in your life that were beyond your control that led to a massive amount of hurt in your life. And what this portion of Joseph's story is showing us this morning is that God maybe didn't cause your difficulty because he doesn't do evil, but he can sure use your situation. No matter how difficult your situation may be, your God is bigger still. And it just might be that the pain you are going through is what's going to lead you to a furthering of his plans and purposes, which are so much greater than what you can see right now. See, God isn't surprised by the sin that happens in our life that brings destruction, but he will always be stronger than it. And he can steer all situations towards his good plans and purposes. So the question for us now becomes, will we choose to trust him before we know how he's going to use this difficult situation? I think when we get onto this topic, it makes us wonder, well, why didn't God just prevent all of this from happening in the first place? And we wonder that in our lives too, when we face difficult circumstances, and we may never know. We can make our guesses, but ultimately we should acknowledge that maybe we weren't meant to know. But what we do know from this story is that God will never leave us, even when we have to go through it. Even when he may allow us to walk through difficulty, he is not absent. God's presence remains with Joseph. And let's see how it comes through, even as he is a foreigner in a foreign land. And I imagine in Joseph's mind, he's expecting that things would hopefully improve after surviving the pit, but he is about to be disappointed. Sometimes life gets harder before we can start to see what God is doing, and that's exactly what happens in Joseph's life. Chapter 37 ends as Joseph just so happens to land in the possession of Potiphar, who is captain of the guard in Egypt. And God is clearly using this situation to position him for something that's going to take place. And in chapter 39, Joseph does well as Potiphar's servant. In fact, he does so good that he ends up in charge of his whole estate. And Potiphar's house is now being blessed because of Joseph. However, Joseph's character is going to be tested as he is raised to such a prominent position. And in Genesis chapter 39, verse 6, I want to pick up the text there. It says this: Now was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except for you, because you are his wife. How then can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And one day, he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Joseph did the right thing. He withstood the test. And yet again, he finds himself as the victim of another person's jealousy. And because of their evil, he loses his prominent position, and now he is thrown into prison. His situation got much worse. But while he is in prison, God is still with him. And the prison warden is blessed because Joseph is there with him. And Joseph, even in prison, is raised to a prominent position. And while he is there, two other prison mates, they receive dreams, but they don't know how to interpret them. But because God is with Joseph, Joseph is able to interpret their dreams. And the only thing he asks is that as the cupbearer is restored to his position, the fulfillment of the dream comes true, that he would remember Joseph and mention him. But Joseph isn't remembered by the cupbearer for many years. Until Pharaoh himself, he has a dream, and he's unable to interpret it. Then the cupbearer remembers, "I knew a guy in prison who was able to interpret my dreams." So Pharaoh calls Joseph. Picking up the text in chapter 41, verse 14, it says this: "So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it.' 'I cannot do it,' Joseph replied to Pharaoh, 'but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires.' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I have never seen such ugly cows in all of the land of Egypt. And the lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, 'The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God is going to do it soon." Joseph, he tells Pharaoh to choose a wise and discerning man and put him in charge of Egypt to store the grain during those years of abundance so that it will last through them throughout the famine. Then, jumping to verse 39, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Joseph, he faced even more injustice when he was in Potiphar's house and when he's in prison. Yet his character is being forged even stronger throughout these trials. See, what I believe the greatest miracle in this story is not that his ability to interpret dreams. The greatest miracle is that suffering never turns him bitter. He remains faithful in the pit. He remained faithful in Potiphar's house. He remained faithful in prison. And that same character that made him trustworthy as a servant and as a prisoner will eventually make him trustworthy as a ruler. Because it's that character that's going to be the most valuable asset that God is going to use when he gives him the power and the position that he has been preparing him for, so that he can use him to do great things. See, God used 13 years of hardship to shape Joseph into the kind of leader he would need to be in Egypt. And I wonder if God might be doing the same thing in your life. Oftentimes, we have our plans laid out, we have our expectations, and we know exactly what we want from God. But when life takes us on a different path, what is our response? I think what this story is showing us is that these detours are actually opportunities for us to grow our character, to become more resilient. And I believe this portion of the Joseph story is showing us that God often develops our character before he decides to expand our influence. Joseph received his dream at 17, but he doesn't get the position until he's 30. That gives 13 years between the promise and the fulfillment, not because God forgot about Joseph, but rather because Joseph was becoming the kind of man who could carry the weight of the promise that God was going to give him. I think oftentimes in our life, we ask for the fruit to come before the tree is strong enough to actually hold it. We want the fruit of a life of faithfulness without having the hard work of growing the roots deep down enough to support it. Maybe you found yourself in that situation. You've asked God for influence before you've actually developed enough integrity to have it. Maybe you asked God for success, but you haven't learned yet faithfulness, trust, and obedience. Oftentimes, we ask God for the harvest before we spent time actually tilling the soil of our own hearts. So what would it look like for us to stay faithful to God, to grow strong roots in him, and let him provide the fruit when we are actually ready for it? Joseph was faithful to God for years without any rewards. He was faithful to his father's instruction, faithful in Potiphar's household, faithful in prison, even when he was forgotten by those whom he had helped. But God is perfect in his timing. And he brought him before Pharaoh at the exact right time to give him a position of highest honor. I want to remind you that God sees your little acts of faithfulness, and at just the right time, he will choose to bring fruit from it. I believe we are living in a culture, I know we are living in a culture that attention spans are shrinking. Our attention span now, they say, is shorter than a goldfish or something like that. I think a lot of us have heard that, but I think in a similar way to our attention spans that are shrinking, I think our ability to be faithful is also shrinking as well. We've come to expect things instantly, and when things don't improve on the same day or even the next week, we lose hope and we lose faith so quickly. But if we want to grow strong in our faithfulness, it will require time. And Joseph's story shows us that the results of his faithfulness, they took time to grow. Think about it in marriage. I think it's very similar. Marriage is one of those ways that faithfulness is rewarded over long periods. Nobody is celebrating the husband who remained faithful to his wife for only 3 weeks after getting married. Faithfulness is measured over the long haul, over the many years of being together. And the strongest marriages aren't built on dramatic moments, but those thousands of ordinary acts where you choose to put your spouse before yourself in ways that most people will never see. We need to be a people like that in our faith, who choose faithfulness over the long haul, not just in our marriages, not just in our family, not just in our friendship, but especially in our spiritual lives. Maybe right now you find yourself in a season where God is developing your character, where he's building faithful endurance in you. My encouragement this morning is for you not to walk away while the seed is still in the ground. God is doing something, and he will bring a harvest at just the right time. God may be preparing you for a season of fruitfulness, but first he is spending time building those roots down deep and strong and growing a tree that can handle the weight of it. Which means that right now your responsibility is to be faithful, and you need to learn to trust that God will bring the fruit at the right time. Because Joseph, he wasn't able to open those prison doors and set himself free. Joseph couldn't make Pharaoh dream the dream. He couldn't force that cupbearer to remember him at the right moment, but Joseph was faithful to what God was doing wherever he had placed him. And that doesn't mean that our obedience and our faithfulness is our way of manipulating God into giving us what we want. Absolutely no guarantee that he will ever reward our faithfulness in this life. Sometimes the fruit comes in this life, sometimes it may not. But God will never waste your faithfulness. So now, Joseph is in charge of Egypt. Things are going well. He has been given a wife and 2 children. The land is prosperous for 2 years, and then famine comes. In verse 57, it says this, "And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe, not just in Egypt, but everywhere." And it's at this point of the story that Joseph's brothers enter the scene again. His brothers come before him in a state of weakness and dependency. They need Joseph's help. The famine has reached as far as his own hometown, and now his family has run out of food. But they have heard that there is grain in Egypt, so they've come to buy some so that they can feed themselves. And now in this timeline, it's been about probably over 20 years since his brothers originally sold him to merchants. And now Joseph is here, and they have come back in a state of weakness and dependency, and he has the perfect opportunity to get them back. With his position and with his power, he could kill them. Or he could just simply deny them food and let them die of starvation. Or he could simply just hold his success over their heads and gloat about how his dream has finally come true. In this story, Joseph is described as being conflicted with a variety of emotions. And as it turned out, as his brothers came before him, they did not recognize him, but he recognized them. So he keeps himself disguised, and he acts harshly towards them. He even accuses them of being spies. But what Joseph is doing in this section is he is testing their character. He has to decide if they are ready to come back into his life or not. And so he decides to withhold one of their brothers, and he will only release them back if they bring their youngest brother to him to prove that their story is true. Joseph, he tests their character this way to see if they'll come back for that other brother or abandon him like they did to Joseph. Joseph lets them go with the grain, and as he does, he shows mercy to them, and he puts the money they used to buy their grain back in their sacks. You can see that Joseph, the conflicting emotion is going on because he still has a soft spot for his brother, but he masks it by acting so harshly. And after using up all of the grain, Joseph's brothers do return to Egypt once again, and they bring their youngest brother along with them this time. A younger brother Joseph hasn't seen since he was a teenager. And in Joseph's eyes, he has seen character improvements in his brothers as they have done what they said they would do. And he decides to bring them into the house, and he treats them kindly. But he has one last test to see if they're trustworthy to come back into his life. And he tests them again by placing one of his silver cups in the sack of the youngest brother, Benjamin. Joseph then sends guards to find them and expose that silver cup. The youngest brother is found guilty. But Judah, the one responsible for selling Joseph 20 years earlier, he acts differently this time. Rather than let the youngest brother get taken prisoner in Egypt, he actually stands in the gap in order to save him and spare his father from any more grief. It's in this moment that Joseph sees true change in his brothers, and he's able to let them back into his life. And at this point, he reveals his true identity. So I want to pick back up the text in verse 1 of chapter 45, where it says this. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers weren't able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land. And for the next 5, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So it is not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near to me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, all you have, I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household, all who belong to you, will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father all about the honor accorded to me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. And when the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land. You are also directed to tell them, do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives and your father, and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours. Joseph's family is finally reunited. And once Pharaoh hears of this, he's pleased to have them come stay in the land of Egypt and give them the best that the land has to offer. See, Joseph in the story, he's been able to move past the hurt that was caused to his brothers so long ago. But when his father dies years later in the story, Joseph's brothers wonder if Joseph might still be harboring resentment towards them. In verse 15 of chapter 50, it says this, when Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers, the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servant of your God, of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph's character remained faithful even when he was risen to a place of power and prestige. Even when he could leverage that power to take revenge, he shows restraint because he refuses to let bitterness rule his heart. Joseph exercises control over the internal, conflicting, and heavy emotions. And he's able to do this because he now sees the whole picture. He sees that this whole unexpected journey was a plan that God was using to preserve Abraham's descendants. This text wants us to see that Joseph is able to forgive because he sees the bigger picture. He sees the larger story that God is writing. The climax and the finish of this story is verse 20 of chapter 50, where it says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph never minimizes the evil that has been done. He doesn't call the evil good. He simply recognizes that God has the ability to redeem what humans wanted to destroy. Joseph's ability to forgive was rooted in his confidence that God is truly and ultimately in control. He didn't have to take revenge into his own hands. He didn't have to settle the score because he trusted that God was still writing his story. And in the same way, when we choose to trust God's sovereignty, we become free from the burden of revenge. We don't have to let sin or evil define our story. We can instead let God get the final word. See, our story finally reaches a climax when Joseph is all powerful. He is towering over his brothers. They are weak, they are needy, they are desperate. And this is the moment where we want Joseph's brothers to finally get what they deserve. I think as we read this story, some of us might actually be a little disappointed at what happens in that story. We're left wondering, why did the brothers get off so easy? It's almost like there's a missed opportunity for justice to be served. I don't know about you, but I've been conditioned by Hollywood movies to expect justice to be served right there. Think about it. Every time a movie has a villain, the story develops to where you grow in your hatred towards that villain so much that you're ready to destroy him when that opportunity comes. And maybe it's just a little more prevalent in me because Allison, my wife and I right now are rewatching the Marvel movies after the kids go to bed. It's partly nostalgic for us, but at the same time, I see that growing in me. Every single movie, the plot is thickening and thickening to where you hate that and you just want them to be done with. You want that justice to come. You're hoping the villain will get what they deserve, be repaid for the harm and destruction they caused. And that's why Joseph's story is so surprising. Instead of revenge, he chooses restoration. Instead of punishing his brothers, he offers them grace. Joseph's story provides a better alternative than the revenge we so naturally want to seek. But it goes against everything we've been conditioned to want, doesn't it? So what would it look like to be someone who isn't so caught up in the punishment that other people deserve? What would it look like to become a people who offer grace instead? I think a lot of us, we aren't that severe of where we're plotting the revenge that we'll take on our enemy. But I think we're doing something a little more quiet, but just as destructive sometimes. Sometimes in our heads, we just continue to replay the conversation that didn't go so well. We rehearse over and over again the offense that person did to us. We imagine it, we replay it. We think about the things we wish we would have said in that moment. Because of our hurt, we start putting distance between us and other people, sometimes even the people that are closest to us. And we make sure we keep a record of all those ways that we have been wronged. And over time, we continue to hold on to that unforgiveness, and we hold on to those wounds that have been done to us, and over time, it makes our hearts bitter. But I want to remind you of a wise saying: harboring unforgiveness is like drinking poison, hoping your enemy is going to die. You see, the person that bitterness hurts the most is usually the person who is carrying it for so many years. Many of us struggle to truly forgive. We hold on to that unforgiveness. We let it turn into bitterness, and if we do, that will eventually wreck our lives. Joseph didn't do that. He was able to move past it because he chose to focus on how God was working, how God was working all things for his good plans and purposes. And each of us have the opportunity to do the same thing. Even that evil that has come against us and hurt us, while it is never justified, it can still be used by God to further his plans and purposes. So I want to invite you to choose to focus on how God is moving rather than getting stuck in that pattern of unforgiveness that leads to bitterness. Joseph's response to affliction ultimately points to someone who is to come, who is even greater. Because just like Joseph, Jesus was betrayed by those who were closest to him. And just like Joseph, Jesus was falsely accused. And just like Joseph, Jesus suffered even though he was innocent. And just like Joseph, Jesus became the means through which others would be saved. And while hanging on the cross, Jesus, he looked at the very people who crucified him, and he uttered these words: "Father, forgive them." Forgiveness, mercy, and grace, they don't mean we're unwise. Joseph, he extended grace in a slow and discerning way before he let his brothers fully into his life. So we don't need to rush things, but we can be wise and still follow the ways of Jesus. As we began this morning, I started talking about how I am very and maybe a little too trusting of Apple Maps. I mentioned that example of how I took an unfamiliar back road up the mountain just to encounter a rocky dirt trail. And we actually started going up that dirt trail. We thought we might be able to make it, but we soon ran into a gate that was locked, and it had a sign on it that said this path was reserved for service vehicles only. So we switched to a different GPS app, and we got back around the mountain and took the familiar road that we knew, and it took way longer than we expected, but we eventually got there. Following God's lead isn't the same as following Apple Maps. When detours happen, there is no fence that gets in his way that he cannot cross in order to get to that destination he has planned. Which means we can trust him because he is still working even when we may not see what he is doing. For Joseph, his brothers thought they would get the final word. But their plot to destroy his life was only one chapter of the story, and it did not define Joseph's ending. God used all of it to accomplish his purposes, and in the end, God is the one who got the final word. The same is true for you. The betrayal you experience is not the end of your story. The injustice you had to endure is not the end of your story. The wound you are carrying with you is not the end of your story. God will always get the final